Hello guys, so today's fourth session of uh, the discovery of India, and let's get started. Chapter 3, The Quest. The Paranormal of India's Past. During these years of thoughts and activities, my mind had been full of India, trying to understand her and to analyze my own reaction towards her. I went back to my childhood days and tried to remember when I felt like then, what vague shapes this conception took in my growing mind, and how it was molded by fresh experience. Sometimes it receded into the background, but it was always there, slowly changing, a queer mixture derived from old stories and legends and old facts. It produced a sensation of pride in me as well as that of shame. For I was ashamed of much that I saw around me, of superstitious practices, of overworn ideas, and above all, subjects and, and poverty stricken states. As I grew up and became engaged in activities which promised to lead to India's freedom, I became obsessed with the thoughts of India. What was this India that possessed me and beckoned to me continually, urging me to action so that we might realize some vague but deeply felt desire of our hearts? The initial urge came to me, I suppose, through pride, both individual and national, and the desire common to all men to resist another's domination and have freedom to live their lives of our choice. It seems monstrous to me that great country like India with a rich and immemorial past should be bound hands and foot to a faraway island which imposed its will upon her. It was still more monstrous that this forcible union has resulted in poverty and degradation beyond measures. That was reason enough for me and for others to act. But it was not enough to satisfy the questioning that arose within me. What is this India? Apart from her physical and geographical aspect, what did she represent in the past? What gave strength to her then? How did he lose that old strength? And has she lost it completely? Does she represent anything vital now, apart from being the home of a vast number of human beings? How does she fit into the modern world? The wider international aspect of the problem grew upon me as I realized more and more how isolation was both undesirable and impossible. The future that took shape in my mind was one of intimate cooperation, politically, economically, and culturally between India and the other countries of the world. But before the future came, there was the present, and behind the present lay the long and tangled past, out of which the present has grown. So, to the past I looked for understanding. India was in my blood, and there was much in her that instinctively thrilled me. And yet, I approached almost as an alien critic, full of dislike for the present as well as for many of the relics of the past that I saw. To some extent, I came to her via the West and looked to her as a friendly Westerner might have done. I was eager and anxious to change her outlook and appearance and give her the garb of modernity. And yet, doubts arose within me. Do I know India? I, who presumed to scrap much of her past heritage. That was great deal and has to be scrapped. That must be scrapped. But surely India could not have been what she undoubtedly was, and could not have continued a cultural existence for thousands of years if she had not possessed something very vital and enduring, something that was worthwhile. What was this something? I stood on the mounds of Mohenjo-daro in the Indus Valley, in the northwest of India, and all around me lay the houses and streets of the ancient cities that is said to have existed over 5,000 years ago. And even then, it was an old and well developed civilization, the Indus civilization, writes Professor Child, represented a very perfect adjunctment of human life to a specific environment that can only have resulted from years of patient efforts, and it was endured. It is already specifically Indian and forms the basis of modern Indian culture. Astonishing thought that any culture or civilization should have this continuity for 5 or 6 thousand years or more, and not in a static, unchanging sense. For India was changing and progressing all this time. She was coming into intimate contact with the Persians, the Egyptians, the Greek, the Chinese, the Arabs, and Central Asian, and the people of the Mediterranean. But though she influenced them and was influenced by them, her cultural basis was strong enough to endure. What was the secret of this strength? Where did it come from? I read her history and read also a part of her abundant ancient literature, and was powerfully impressed by the vigor of the thought, the clarity of the language, and the richness of the mind that lays behind it. I journeyed through India in the company of mighty travelers from China and Western and Central Asia who came here in the remote past and left records of their travels. I thought of what India has accomplished in East Asia, in Angkor, in Borobudur, and many other places. I wandered over the Himalayas, which were closely connected with old myths and legends, and which has influenced so much of our thought and literature. My love of the mountains and my kinship with Kashmir especially drew me to them, and I saw there not only the life and vigor and beauty of the present, but also memorized loveliness of the age past. The mighty rivers of India that flow from the great mountain barriers into the plains of India attracted and reminded me of innumerable phases of our history. The Indus or Sindhu, from which our country came to be called India and Hindustan, and across which races and tribes and caravans and armies have come for thousands of years, the Brahmaputra, rather cut off from the main current history, but living in old stories, forcing its way into India through deep chasms cut in the hearts of the northeast mountains, and then flowing calmly into a gracious sweep between mountains and wooded plains. The Jamuna, round with clusters so many legends of dances and fun and play, and the Ganges, above all the rivers of India, which have held India's herd captive and drawn uncontrolled millions to her banks since the dawn of history. The story of the Ganga, from her source to the sea, from old times to new, is the story of India's civilization and culture, of the rise and fall of empires, of great and proud cities, of the adventures of men and the quest of the mind, which has so occupied India's thinkers, of the richness and the fulfillment of life, as well as its denial and renunciation, of ups and downs and growths and decay, of life and death. I visited old monuments and ruins and ancient sculptures and frescoes, Ajanta, Ellora, and Elephanta caves and other places, and I also saw these lovely buildings of a later age in Agra and Delhi, where every stone told its story of India's past. In my own city of Allahabad and Haridwar, I would go to the great bathing festivals, the Kumbh Mela, and see hundreds of thousands of people come as their forebears have come for thousands of years from all over India to bath in the Ganga. I would remember description of the festivals written 1300 years ago by Chinese travelers, pilgrims, and others. And even then, these melas were ancient and lost in an unknown antiquity. What was the tremendous faith, I wondered, that has drawn our people for untold generations to this famous river of India? These journeys and visits of mine, with the background of my reading, gave me an insight into the past. To a somewhat bare intellectual understanding was added an emotional appreciation and gradually a sense of reality began to creep into my mental picture of India, and the land of my forefathers became people with living beings who laughed and wept, loved and suffered, and among them were people who seemed to know life and understand it, and out of their wisdom, they have built a structure which gave India cultural stability, which lasted for thousands of years. Hundreds of vivid pictures of the past filled my mind, and they would stand out as soon as I visited a particular place associated with them. At Sarnath near Benares, I would almost see the Buddha preaching his first sermon, and some of his recorded words would come like a distant echo to me around 2500 years. Ashoka's pillars of stone with the inscription would speak to me in their magnificent language and tell me of the men who though an emperor was greater than any king or emperor. At Fatehpur Sikri, Akbar, forgetful of his empire, was seated holding converse and debate with the learned of all faiths, curious to learn something new and seeking into answers to the eternal problems of man. Thus, slowly, the long panorama of India's history unfolded itself before me, with its ups and downs, its triumphs and defeats. There seemed to me something unique about the continuity of a cultural tradition through 5,000 years of history, of invasions and upheaval, a tradition which was widespread among the masses and powerfully influenced them. Only China had have had such a continuity of tradition and cultural life, and this panorama of the past gradually merged into the unhappy present, where India, for all past greatness and stability, was a slave country, an appendage of Britain, and all over the world terrible and devastating wars was raging and brutalizing humanity. But that vision of 5,000 years gave me a new perspective, and the burden of the present seemed to grow lighter. The 180 years of British rule in India was just one of the unhappy interlude in her long story. We would find itself again. She would find herself again. Already, the last page of this chapter was being written. The world also will survive the horrors of today and build itself anew on fresh foundation. Nationalism and internationalism. My reaction to India thus was often an emotional one, conditioned and limited in many areas. It took the form of nationalism. In the case of many people, the conditioning and limiting factors are absent, but nationalism was and is inevitable in the India of my day. It is a natural and healthy growth. For any subject country, national freedom must be the first and dominant urge, for India and her intense sense of individuality and past heritage, it was undoubtedly sorry. Recent events all over the world have demonstrated that the notion that nationalism is fading away before the impact of internationalism and proletarian movements have little truth. It is still one of the most powerful urges that move a people, and round it cluster sentiment and traditions and a sense of common living and common purpose. While the intellectual strata of the middle class was gradually moving away from nationalism, or so they thought, labor and proletariat movements deliberately based on internationalism were drifting towards nationalism. The coming of war swept everybody, everywhere, into the net of nationalism. This remarkable resurgence of nationalism, or rather a rediscovery of it, and a new realization of its vital significance, has raised new problems and altered the form and shape of old problems. Old established traditions cannot be easily scrapped or dispensed with. In moments of crisis, they rise and dominate the mind of men, and often, as we have seen, a deliberate attempt is made to use those traditions to rouse a people to a high pitch of efforts and sacrifice. Traditions have to be accepted to a largest extent and adopted and transformed to meet new conditions and ways of thoughts, and at the same time new traditions have to be built up. The nationalist ideal is deep and strong. It is not a thing of the past with no future significance, but other ideals, more based on the ineluctable facts of today, have arisen. The international ideal and the proletariat ideal, and there must be some kind of fusion between these various ideals if they are to have world equilibrium and the lessening of conflict. The abiding appeal of nationalism is to the spirit of men, has to be recognized and provided for, but its way limited to a narrower sphere. If nationalism is still so universal in its influence, even in countries powerfully affected by new ideas and international forces, how much more must it dominate the mind of India? Something we are told that our nationalism sometimes we are told that our nationalism is a sign of our backwardness, and even our demand for independence indicates our narrow-mindedness. Those who tell us so seems to imagine that true internationalism would triumph if we agree to remain a junior partner in the British Empire or Commonwealth of Nations. They do not appear to realize that this particular type of so called internationalism is only an extension of a narrow British nationalism, which could not have appealed to us even if its logical consequence was Anglo Indian history have not utterly rooted out its possibility from our minds. Nevertheless, India, for all her intense nationalistic fervor, had gone further than many nations in her acceptance of real internationalism and the coordination, and even to some extent the subordination of the independent nations states to the world organization. India's strength and weakness. The search for the sources of India's strength and her deterioration and decay is long and intricate. Yet the recent causes of that decay are obvious enough. She fell behind in the march of technique, and Europe, which had long been backward in many matters, took the lead in technical progress. Behind this technical progress was the spirit of science and a bubbling life and spirit which displayed itself in many activities and in adventurous voyages of discovery. New techniques gave military strength to the country of West Europe, and it was easy for them to spread out and dominate the East. That is the story not only India but almost whole of Asia. Just a second. Yeah. Why this should have happened so is more difficult to unravel. For India was not lacking in mental alertness and technical skills in earlier times. Our skills, our sense, one sense says a progressive deterioration during centuries. The urge to life and endeavor became less. The creative spirit faded away and gave place to the imitative. When triumphant and rebellious thoughts have tried to pierce the mysterious mysteries of nature and the universe, the worldly commitment come with his glosses and long explanations. Magnificent arts and sculptures gave way to meticulous carving of intricate details without nobility of conception or design. The vigor and richness of language, powerful yet simple, are followed by highly ornate and complex literary forms. The urge to adventure and the overflowing life which led to vast schemes of distant colonization and the transplantation of Indian culture in faraway lands, all these faded away, and a narrow orthodoxy taboos, even the crossing of the high seas. A rational spirit of inquiry so evident in earlier times, which might well have led to further growth of science, is replaced by irrationalism and blind idolatry of the past. Indian life became a sluggish stream living in the past, moving slowly through the accumulation of death, dead centuries. The heavy burden of the past crushes it, and a kind of coma seized it. It is not surprising that in this condition of mental stupor and physical weariness, India should have deteriorated and remained rigid and immobile, while other parts of the world marched ahead. Yet, this is not a complete or wholly correct survey. If there had only been a long and unrelieved period of rigidity and stagnation, this might well have resulted in a complete break with the past, the death of an era, and the erection of something new on its ruins. There has not been such a break, and there is a definite continuity. Also, from time to time, vivid periods of renaissance have occurred, and some of them have been long and brilliant. Always there is visible an attempt to understand and adopt the new and harmonize it with the old, or or at any rate with parts of the old which were considered worth preserving. Often the old retained an external form only, and a kind of symbol, and change its inner content. But something vital and living continues. Some urge during the people in a direction not only not wholly realized, and always a desire for synthesis between the old and the new. It was this urge and desire that kept them going and enabled them to absorb new ideas while retaining much of the old. Whether there was such a thing as an Indian dream throughout the ages, vivid and full of life, or something reduced to the murmuring of the troubled sleep, I do not know. Every people and every nation have some such beliefs or myths of national destiny, and perhaps it is partly true in each case. Being in India, I am myself influenced by the reality or myth about India, and that something, I feel that anything that have had the power to mold hundreds of generations without a break must have drawn in its enduring vitality from some deep well of strength, and have the capacity to renew this vitality from age to age. Was there some such well of strength? And if so, did it dry up, or did it have hidden springs to replenish it? What of today? Are there any springs still functioning from which we can refresh or strengthen ourselves? We are our race, or rather, an old mixture of many races, and our racial memories go back to the dawn of time. Have we had our days, and are we now living in the late afternoon or evening of our existence? Just carrying on after the manner of the aged, quiescent, devitalized, and creative desire for peace and sleep above all else? No people, no race remains unchanged. Continually, they are mixing with others and slowly changing. They may appear to die almost and then rise again as a new people, or just a variation of the old. There may be a definite break between the old people and the new, or a vital link of thought and ideals may join them. History has numerous instances of old and well established civilization fading away or being ended suddenly, and vigorous new cultures taking their place. Is it some vital energy, some inner source of strength that gives life to a civilization or a people, without which all of it is ineffective, like the vain attempt of an aged person to play the part of youth? Among the people of the world today, I've sensed this vital energy chiefly in three: Americans, Russian, and the Chinese. A queer combination. American, in spite of having their roots in the old world, and are a new people, uninhabited and without the burden and complexes of old races. And it is easily to understand their abounding vitality. So also are the Canadians, Australians, and New Zealanders, all of them largely cut off from the old world and facing life in all of its newness. Russia are not a new people, And yet there have been a complete break from the old, like that of a death, and they have been reincarnated anew in a manner of which there is no example in history. They have become youthful again and an energy and vitality that are amazing. They are searching for some of their old roots again, but for all practical purposes, they are a new people, a new race, and a new civilization. Russians, yeah, the Russian example shows how a people can revitalize itself, become youthful again, if it is if it is prepared to pay the price for it and tap the spring of suppressed strength and energy almost among the masses. Perhaps this war, with all its horrors and fright, might result in the rejuvenation of other peoples also, such as survived from the Holocaust. The Chinese stand apart from all these. They are not a new race, nor have they gone through the shock of change from top to bottom which came to Russia. Undoubtedly, 7 years of cruel war had changed them, as it must. How far this change is due to the war or to the more abiding cause, or whether it is a mixture of the two, I do not know. But the vitality of the Chinese people astonishes me. I cannot imagine a people endowed with such bedrock strength going under. Something of the vitality which I saw in China, I have sensed at times in Indian people also. Not always in any ways. It is difficult for me to take an objective view. Perhaps my wishes distorted my thinking, but always I have searched for this in my wandering among the Indian people. If they have this vitality, then it was well with them and they would make good. If they lacked it completely, then our political efforts and shouting were all make believe and would not carry us any far. I was not interested in making some political arrangement which would enable our people to carry on more or less as before, only a little better. I felt they have vast stores of suppressed energy and ability, and I want to release these and make them feel young and vital again. India, constituted as she is, cannot play a secondary part in the world. She will either count for the great deal or not count at all. No middle position attracts me, nor did I think any intermediate position feasible. Besides, the past quarter of century struggle of India's independence and all over conflicts with British authority lays in my mind and that of any other, the desire to revitalize India. We felt that through action and self imposed suffering and sacrifice, through voluntary facing risk and danger, through refusal to submit to what we considered evil and wrong, through would we recharge the battery of India's spirit and waken her from her long slumber. Though we came into conflict continuously with the British government in India, our eyes were always turned towards our own people. Political advantage have value only in so far as it helps in the fundamental process of ours. Because of this governing motive, frequently we acted as no politicians moving into narrow spheres of politics only would have done, and foreign and Indian critics expressed surprise at the folly and intra-singence of our ways. Whether we were foolish or not, the historians of the future will judge. We aimed high and looked far. Probably we were often foolish from the point of view of opportunist politics. But at no time did we forget that our main purpose was to raise the whole level of the Indian people, psychologically and spiritually, and also, of course, politically and economically. It was the building up of the real inner strength of the people that we were after, knowing that the rest would inevitably follow. We have to wish our people, we have to wipe our some generations of shameful subservience and timid submission to an arrogant alien authority. The search for India. Though through books and old monuments and past cultural achievements helped to produce some understanding of India, they do not satisfy me or give me the answer I was looking for. Nor would they, or for they dealt with the past ages, and I wanted to know if there was any real connection between the past and the present. The present for me and for many others like me was an odd mixture of medievalism, appealing poverty and misery, and a somewhat superficial modernism of the middle class. I was not an admirer of my own class or kind, and yet inevitably I looked off to it for the leadership in the struggle of India's salvation. That middle class felt caged and circumscribed and wanted to grow and develop itself, unable to do so within the framework of British rule. A spirit of revolt grew against this rule, and yet this spirit was not directed against the structure that crushed us. It sought to retain it and control it by displacing the British. These middle classes were too much the product of the structure to challenge it and seek to uproot it. New forces arose that drove us to the masses in the village, and for the first time, a new and different India rose up before the young intellectuals who have almost forgotten its existence or attached little importance to it. It was a disturbing sight, not only because of its stark misery and the magnitude of its problems, but because it began to upset some of our values and conclusions. So began for us the discovery of India as it was, and it produced both understanding and conflicts of India as it was, and it produced both understanding and conflict within us. Sorry. Our reactions varied and depend on our previous environment and experience. Some were already sufficiently acquainted with these village mass not to experience any new sensation. They took them for granted, but for me it was a real voyage of discovery. And while I was always painfully conscious of the failings and weakness of my people, I found in India's country folk something different, difficult to define, which attracted me. That's something I had missed in our middle classes. I do not idealize the conception of the masses, and as far as possible, I try to avoid thinking of them as a theoretical abstraction. The people of India are very real to me, in their great variety and in spite of their vast number. I try to think of them as individuals rather than a vague vast number. I try to think of them as individuals rather than vague groups. Perhaps it was because I did not expect much of them that I was not disappointed. I found more than I have expected. It struck me that perhaps the reason of this was for a certain stability and potential strength that they possessed, was the old Indian cultural tradition, which was still retained by them in a small measure. Much have gone in the battering they have received during the past 2000 years. Yet something remained that was worthwhile, and with it so much that was worthless and evil. During the 20s, my work was largely confined to my own provinces, and I traveled extensively and intensively through the towns and villages of the 48 districts of the UP, United Provinces of Agra and Awadh, that heart of Hindustan as it has been considered, the seat and center of both ancient and medieval civilization, the melting pot of so many races and culture, the area where the Great Revolution of 1857 blazed up and was later ruthlessly crushed. I grew to know the sturdy Jats of the northern and western districts, the typical son of the soil, brave and independent looking, relatively more prosperous, the Rajput peasants and petty landholders, still proud of his race and ancestry, even though he might have changed his faith and adopted Islam. The deft and skillful artisans and cottage workers, both Hindu and Muslim, The poorer peasantry and tenants in their vast numbers, especially in Awadh and in the eastern district, crushed and grounded down by generation of oppression and poverty, hardly daring to hope that a change would come to better their lot, and yet hoping and full of faith. During the 30s, in the interval of my life out of prison, and especially during election campaigns in 1936-37, I traveled more extensively throughout India, in towns and cities and villages alike, except for rural Bengal, which unhappily I was only rarely visited. I toured into every province and went deep into villages. I spoke to political and economic issues and judging for my speech. I was full of politics and elections. But all this while, in a corner of my mind, laid something deeper and more vivid, and elections or the other excitement of the passing day meant little to me. Another and a major excitement had seized me, and I was again on a great voyage for discovery, and the land of India and the people of India laid spread out before me. India, with all her infinite charms and variety, began to grow upon me more and more, and yet the more I saw of her, the more I realized how very difficult it was for me or for anyone else to grasp the ideas she had embodied. I was not her wide space that eluded me, or even her diversity, but some depth of soul which I could not fathom, though I had occasional and tantalizing glimpse of it. She was like some ancient palimpsest on which layers upon layers of thoughts and reverie have been inscribed, and yet no succeeding layer had completely hidden or erased what had been written previously. All of these existed in our conscious and subconscious self, though we may not have been aware of them, and they have gone to build up the complex and mysterious personality of India. That sphinx like face, with its elusive and somewhat mocking smile, was to be seen throughout the length and breadth of the land, though outwardly there was diversity, an infinite variety among our people. Everywhere there was the tremendous impress of oneness which had held all of us together for past ages, whatever political fate or misfortune had befallen us. The unity of people was no longer merely an intellectual concept for me, it was an emotional experience that overpowered me. That essential unity had been so powerful that no political division, no disaster or catastrophe have been able to overcome it. It was absurd, of course, to think India or any country a kind of anthropomorphic entity. I did not do so. I was not fully aware of the diversities and divisions of Indian life, of class, caste, religion, race, different degree of cultural development. Yet, I think that a country with a long cultural background and a common outlook on life develops a spirit that is peculiar to it, and that is impressed on all its children, however much they may differ among themselves. Can anyone fail to see that this in China, whether he met an old fashioned Mandarin or a communist who had apparently broken with the past? It was the spirit of India that I was after, not through ideal curiosity, though I was curious enough, but because I felt that it might give me some key to the understanding of my country and people, some guidance to thought and action. Politics and elections were day to day affairs, which when we grew excited over triumphant matters. But if we were going to build the houses of India's future, strong and secure and beautiful, we would have to dig deep for the foundation. So that was it for today, and we will continue this chapter tomorrow.